Hello Year 3, it is time for our weekly live read of Stig in the Dump. And this week, hello, Miss Sharrett is going to be reading the second chapter. As Miss Reed did last week, I'm going to be holding up a cue for question. Every time there is a question that I would like you to answer, do not worry, these questions are also on a piece of paper, on a document on the website, okay? Okay. Here we go. This is called Digging with Stig. Now, before I start reading, your first question is, what kind of day is this day? Okay. It was a fine autumn morning, and the grass was very wet with dew outside. Barney pushed his breakfast down as fast as he could manage. What do you want to do today? His grandmother asked as she drank her coffee. I have to go into Seven Oaks this morning. Do you want to come? Barney's heart sank. Going to Seven Oaks? Well, it was all right if he had nothing else to do, but he had to go and see Stig. No, thank you, Granny, he said. I don't think I want to go into Seven Oaks. You'll be quite happy just messing about here? Asked his grandmother. Yes, thank you. I just want to mess about with Stig. Oh, I see, Granny smiled. With your friend Stig. Well, Mrs. Pratt will be here all morning, so if you like, you can stay with her. And with Stig, of course. Lou said she would like to go to town, as she wasn't particularly interested in playing with Stig. Barney knew from the way she said it that she still thought Stig was only a pretend friend, but that was all right. If she didn't want to meet Stig, she needn't. Can I go out now? He asked. All right, said Granny. Put your boots on, she called after him as he shot through the door. Barney's feet made dark prints in the dew as he headed across the lawn towards the chalk pit. Then he stopped and stood still in the middle of the lawn. Suppose he didn't find Stig at all. The sun was bright. The yellow leaves fluttered down from the elm tree onto the grass. A robin puffed its breast on a rose tree and squeaked at him. Barney suddenly wasn't sure that he believed in Stig himself. It wasn't a Stiggish day, like yesterday when he had fallen down the pit. He had fallen, hadn't he? He felt the bump on the back of his head. Yes, that was real enough. He'd fallen and bumped his head. And then what? Funny things did happen when you bumped your head. Perhaps you only saw Sig's when he fell and bumped your head. He didn't think he wanted to fall over the cliff again on purpose and bump his head again. Was Stig a person you could just go and play with, like the other children at the end of the road? At home? He had to find out, but he didn't want to go to the chalk pit and find nothing. He stood with his hand in his pocket in the middle of the lawn, his fingers playing with something hard in the left-hand pocket of his jeans. He remembered something and pulled out the thing he had in his hand. Of course, the flint. He looked at it glinting in the sunlight like a black diamond with its chipped pattern. He'd seen Stig make it. Then there was no mistake about that. Of course, Stig was real. He set off again at a run, climbing the fence into the paddock, and waded through the long wet grass on the other side. The copse around the edge of the chalk pit looked dark beyond the sunlit grass. In the middle of the paddock, he found himself slowing down and stopping again. Something at the back of his mind was telling him that he'd seen pictures of chipped flints in his books, and real ones in museums, and that they were made thousands of years ago by rough people who weren't alive any longer. People found them and put them in cases with notices on them. Perhaps he just found this one, and I imagined everything else. Supposing he hadn't imagined Stig, was he the sort of person who liked people coming to play? Well, he told himself, all he really wanted to do was look at the place where he'd fallen over yesterday, have another look down the dump. There was that bicycle anyway. He walked to the edge of the paddock. A clump of brown grass jumped up from underneath his feet and bounced away towards a bramble patch, showing a white tail and two long ears. Barney's heart bumped, but it was only a rabbit. He ran after it, but it had disappeared in the thick of the undergrowth. Feeling bolder, he climbed over the fence and went carefully towards the edge of the pit, making sure that this time he kept near a big tree that seemed to be well anchored to the side, and peeped over. He could see the patch of raw earth and white chalk where the ground had given way under him, the dangling creepers lower down, and a scatter of broken chalk at the bottom. He craned over to see the hole he had made in the roof of the den. There was a pile of branches and rubbish against the foot of the cliff, but no gaping hole. Not a sign of a hole, of a roof, of a den, of a Stig. He listened. A blackbird turning over dry leaves in search of worms was making a noise much too big for itself. But apart from that, the pit was silent and empty. Barney walked away from the edge of the pit and climbed over the fence into the sunshine of the paddock, thinking hard. He looked at the stone in his hand. He felt the bump on his head. He had seen the raw patch where the ground had given away. He remembered crashing through a sort of roof and leaving a big gaping hole, and yet there wasn't a hole, so he couldn't have made one. But he must have landed somewhere, and he had that clear picture in his head of looking up through a hole at the side of the cliff and the clouds passing over the sky. And suddenly, as he stood in the middle of the paddock, he gave a big jump as the answer came to him, like getting a sum right. If there wasn't a hole, it was because someone had mended it. Stig wasn't the sort of person to leave a large hole in his roof for long, not his friend Stig. All at once, everything fitted together. Yesterday's adventure on that Stiggish sort of afternoon, the bump on his head, the flint, and this bright autumn morning when he was going to visit his friend Stig. And he was quite clear in his mind now what he was going to do and how he was going to do it. He set off, running back to the garden. Presents for Stig. When you visited people this time of year, you always brought something from the garden. Tomatoes. You couldn't bottle up or apples. You hadn't room to store. He looked around the big old apple tree for windfalls. There were some big ones, difficult to manage without a basket, but he stuffed them into his shirt, making sure there weren't any wasp in them first. What else? He saw a line of carrots, his favourite fruit. He was allowed to pull up carrots. They were good for his teeth. So he heaved up a few good-sized ones and rubbed the earth off his fingers. Then he had an idea and ran to the tool shed, where he found a ball of garden string. It was all right just to borrow it, but he ran back again across the garden, over the fence, across the paddock, over into the copse, and through the brambles and dead leaves to the edge of the pit. He sat himself comfortably on the trunk of the tree that curved out over the pit like the neck of a camel, and looked carefully again at what he could see. There was the broken edge of the cliff. There were the trailing creepers. There at the bottom were the scattered lumps of chalk that he had come down with. Now that he was really looking at it, he could see a piece of new linoleum. Well, not exactly new. Nothing in the dump was new, but it looked as if it had been put there not long ago, because it wasn't covered with moss-like things that had been there for a long time. And he could see at one side of the pile of branches and things that Stig's lean-to roof, a faint path in the bottom of the pit that led to the front of the den. Okay, so Barney's given Stig a few presents. I wonder what you would give Stig. Have a think about that. That's your second question. What would you give Stig as a present? He found the end of the ball of string and tied the bunch of carrots to it. Then he began to pay out the string, with the carrots dangling on the end towards the bottom of the pit. He hoped it was long enough. There always seemed to be miles of string in a ball, but it dwindled and dwindled as he lowered the carrots down until it was afraid he couldn't reach the bottom. Bother! A regular spider's nest of tangled string appeared, and he had to stop uncobbling and uncobble it. At last, with a few feet in hand, the carrots were swinging on a level with Stig's front door. Barney's seat was not quite above it, so he had to get the carrots swinging to and fro all that way beneath him, until they were actually knocking at the door like 5 pink fingers. Barney was bubbling so much with laughter inside of him at the trick he was playing on Stig that he forgot to be dizzy. "Stig," he called down the pit. "Morning, Stig. I'm knocking at your front door." And suddenly, out from the stack of branches appeared the tousled head of Stig, and stayed there, wagging to and fro, following the swinging carrots like a cat watching a pendulum. Barney fell off the tree with laughter. "Hello, Stig," he called. "Good morning, I'm Barney. Barney, you remember, how are you?" Stig looked up, and for a moment Barney felt quite frightened at the ferocious scowl on his face, and was glad to be up high, out of his reach. Should he have played a trick on Stig? Perhaps he didn't have what the grown-ups call a sense of humour. Did Stigs have a sense of humour? Why do you think that Stig had a ferocious growl on his face, or frown? That's your third question. But when Stig made out who it was sitting above him, his face suddenly changed. His big white teeth showed in a broad grin. He waved both his arms over his head, and he jumped about in the bottom of the pit to show how pleased he was. "Have a carrot, Stig," called Barney. "For you," he said, pointing to Stig. "To eat," he added. "Good for your teeth," making biting movements. Stig leapt up at the carrots as they swung past, caught them, looked at them closely, smelt them, and then put one in his mouth and crunched it. He looked up at Barney, smiling with his mouth full to show that he liked the present, then made signs which clearly meant that Barney was to come down. Well, I'm not going to jump this time, said Barney, and the string's too thin to climb down. Going round, he said, making circling movements with his arms. He got off his perch and walked the long way round the top of the pit to the shallow end where he got out the night before. It was more difficult finding his way to Stig's den along the floor of the pit than it had been finding his way out the night before. The dump looked quite different, more cheerful, with the sunlight pouring down through the golden autumn leaves and the ash and the sycamore seeds twindling down from the trees on top. But the tail of the aeroplane was only part of a farm machine, and the ship's helm was a broken cartwheel. There was the bicycle too, just a rusty frame with bits of brake hanging onto it. Never mind. He'd found something much more interesting, and he'd seen it and spoken to it in broad daylight. A real live Stig, and he was going to visit him. That's if he could ever find his way amongst the nettles. Suddenly there was Stig coming to meet him, straight through a nettle patch, as if stings meant nothing to him. Barney stopped. What now? Shake hands? Rub noses? No, perhaps not. He remembered the apples he had stowed inside his t-shirt, took one out, and held it towards Stig on the palm of his hand as if he was trying to make friends with a horse. I hope you like the carrots, Stig, said Barney. Have an apple. Stig took the apple quite politely between his finger and thumb, not between his teeth, as Barney somehow expected him to, and sniffed it. Barney took out another apple for himself and bit into it. Good, he said, delicious. Stig took a bite, seemed to like it, smiled, and they both started walking towards the den, munching their apples. Stig just blundered through the nettles. As far as Barney could see, they stung him and raised bumps as they did on other people, but he just didn't care. Barney avoided himself the nettles as much as he could. He got stung once or twice, but decided not to make a fuss about it. Stigs don't mind stings, he thought, so he'd better not. Stig led the way to the den. Barney noticed several stumps of new white chalk near the path, and remembered the new tunnelling he had seen yesterday and the baby's bath full of chalk. Been digging, Stig? He asked, pointing to the dumps. Stig grinned and nodded. It was gloomy and overhung at Stig's end of the pit, even on this bright day. And the den itself, now that there had been a hole in the roof was mended, was even darker. The teapot lamp was flickering and throwing a dim light on the den, and the place where Stig had been digging, but it was not very cheerful. Come to think of it, thought Barney, rabbits and things that live in holes don't have any light at all. Not much fun for them, with no windows. Couldn't he find some windows for Stig? What made it worse was that Stig had started a small fire in the den part. He must have just done it, because Barney had not noticed any smoke when he was sitting on the tree trunk. The smoke was filling the den, and there was no way out for it except for it to trickle through the gaps in the roof. It made Barney's eyes water. He supposed it was one of those things that he just had to put up with, like the nettles. All the same, the place could do with a chimney, as well as windows. He began to get used to the darkness, and he could see that the back of the cave went further back into the chalk than he'd noticed. The digging tools were lying about, the bedstead leg, a broken cast iron shoe scraper, and an iron bar just like the one he'd seen his father use to jack up the car up. Stig was reaching up to offer Barney another turnip, but Barney didn't feel like a turnip so soon after breakfast. Can I help you dig, Stig? He asked. I expect you're busy anyhow. He went to the end of the tunnel and picked up the bit of bedstead and began to attack the wall of the chalk. It was not as easy as he expected. The chalk on the inside of the hill was firm, not crumbly as it was outside when the rain had got to it. Barney's bashes with the awkward piece of metal only broke off smallest chips of chalk, and he was soon puffed. Stig, who had been standing watching him, took the digger from his hands and showed him how to dig out a hollow at the bottom of the chalk wall, then knocked down large chunks which came away easily because they were not held up underneath. There was soon a pile of loose chalk, and Barney picked it up with his hands and used it in the small tin bath. When it was full, it was about as much as he could do to drag it along the floor of the cave towards the entrance. Stig helped him, and between them they lugged the load out of the den and dumped it. But Barney noticed that Stig took care to put it some way from his door. He supposed that new piles of the new white chalk would let people know that something was going on. Stig let him dig next time, and he soon got the hang of cutting under and letting it tumble down from the top. Now and then they would come into a great flint embedded in chalk like a fossil monster with knobs and bulges, and they would have to chip around it, worry it, and loosen it like a tooth until at last it came free, usually bringing down a lot of chalk with it. They worked unhappily for quite a time, taking it in turns to dig and load, and now and then they would stop for a break and take a drink of water from the tin or eat a refreshing apple. Barney's jeans were white with chalk dust, and his hair and nails were full of it. He suddenly wondered what his grandmother would say. Then he suddenly remembered what time it was. In spite of the apple, his tummy was telling him that it might be lunchtime. You haven't got a clothes brush, have you, Stig? He asked. Stig looked blank, and Barney decided that he probably hadn't. His eye fell on Stig's water pipe. Someone had thrown away a vacuum cleaner, so there must have been one of those brush things somewhere. Sure enough, he spied one and fixed as a sort of T-piece on the end of a long thin pole that was helping to hold the roof up. He thought the roof might hold itself for a bit whilst he got the worst of the chalk dust off with the vacuum cleaner end, and it did. Stig was watching Barney with a puzzled look, wondering why he should be pulling down part of his roof to brush out his clothes with. You're lucky, Stig, said Barney. Nobody asked you how you got in such a mess. I have got to go now. Must be nearly lunchtime. Pity I can't ask you to lunch, but really, he thought no one else even believes in him yet. I'll be back this afternoon, Barney said from the door. Thanks for letting me help you. Goodbye. Grandmother and Lou were late getting back from the town, so he had just time to get the chalk out from his nails and hair and to look fairly respectable for lunch. They were too full of talk about how they had spent their morning to question him about what he had been doing. Over the stewed apples, he was able to say quietly, Granny, have you got any things you don't want? Things I don't want, dear, Grandmother repeated. What sort of things? Chilblains? Grandchildren? No, Granny, I mean things like windows and chimneys. Why do you think that Barney's asking his grandmother for things like windows and chimneys? Okay. Grandmother thought about it for a moment and then said that really she couldn't think of anything like windows and chimneys except for windows and chimneys, and she thought the house had just enough of those to go around. And Lou just laughed and said, Really, Barney? Then Grandmother said it did remind her that there were some tins and jam jars she had meant to put away out for the dustbin man, and perhaps Barney could be a dear and carry them to the gate. There were more jam jars than Barney had thought possible, and quite a lot of useful tins, the sort with lids. Barney looked at them. The dustbin man wouldn't say thank you for them, he thought. Why shouldn't Stig have them? He remembered a big wooden box which Grandfather had helped him fix wheels onto so that he and Lou could use it as a cart. He searched round and found it amongst the firewood, but still with its 4 wheels more or less straight and a piece of rope on the front to pull with it with. He loaded it with jam jars and tins and found it quite a weight, and when he set off, the paddock with it. He looked at Flash, the pony, as he struggled through a clump of long grass and called rather crossly, You might come and help pull instead of standing there. But he knew that Flash took quite a lot of persuading to be caught for Lou to ride him, let alone for pulling carts. The pony just stood and watched, tossing his hair now and then at the afternoon flies. By the time Barney had got his load to the edge of the pit, he was quite tired, but there was still the problem of getting them to the bottom. He sat on the camel's neck tree trunk. The string was still there. It was the thick brown sort, and he thought it could be strong enough for a few jam jars. He called to Stig, and after a time, Stig came out backwards, like a badger with its bedding, dragging a load of chalk. I've got some things for you, Stig, Barney called. He pulled up the string and took the end of the pile of jam jars. About 8 of them were packed into a cardboard box. It wouldn't take long to pass them down one by one, so he tied the string around the box, took it carefully along the tree trunk, and started to lower it. It wasn't nearly as easy as the carrots. The box swung wildly, and the string around it started slipping. The part he was holding tried to run through his fingers and burned his hands. He took a turn round the stump of the branch and let it run out around that, hardly daring to look down at what was happening. He hoped Stig wouldn't get a jam jar in his head. The box was hanging by one corner when it reached the ground, but instead of untying it, Stig disappeared into his den. Hey, Stig, undo it, Barney called. There's some more to come. Barney came out again, holding what was left of a large, broad-brimmed lady's straw hat, with ribbons to tie it under the chin. He untied the string from the box and tied it to the ribbons. It was quite a useful-looking cargo sling. Oh, jolly good idea, Stig, Barney shouted. Stig's got brains, he thought. After that, it was quite easy. He pulled up the hat, filled it with jam jars, lowered it down with a string running through the stump of the branch, and waited for Stig to unload, hauled it back up again, and so on. When he had finished the jam jars, he started on the tins, which were much lighter. When he had lowered all the tins, he looked at the truck. How strong is string, he wondered. Could he send the truck down the same way? If he didn't, he would have to trundle it all the way round the top and along the bottom of the pit. He wound the strings a few times round the branch stump, leaving enough loose to reach the trunk or the cliff top, humped himself along the tree, tied the string to the wheel of the truck, moved it back along the trunk, and pulled the truck towards him by the string. The truck lunged over the edge of the cliff, swung wildly outwards on the string, which ran out so fast that he couldn't stop it, until a tangle in the string made it stop with a jerk, and the string broke. The truck was falling through the air. Barney held on for dear life to the tree, with his face against his mossy bark, and shut his eyes. He felt weak and dizzy. At last, he allowed himself to look down. He couldn't see the truck at first. Then he saw that it swung out to land in the branches of an elder tree, which was sitting there, hanging there quite happily. I've sent down the trunk, he called to Stig. May come in useful. He was still feeling what his grandmother used to call hot and cold all over, but he carefully inched himself off the tree and onto firm ground, and set off round and down to the pit. A pity he couldn't let himself down on a rope. But no, he thought, he couldn't try just yet. His idea of sending things down on the string had been a good one, though, he thought to himself as he walked through the copse. Another day he'd have to find some more tins and jam jars to send down. He hoped Stig liked them. They would come in useful for things like that always come in useful if you've got kept them long enough. What do you think they might be useful for Stig's house? Have a think. We're going to find out in a minute. So have a go at answering this question first now. By the time he got to the den, Stig had untangled the truck from the tree and was squatting looking at it and the tins and jam jars. And then Barney wondered what they were going to do with him. These are jam jars, Stig, he explained. Jam and marmalade come in them, and you can use them for keeping stuff in them, like rice and coffee and things like that. But Stig want to keep rice and coffee in his den. And these are tins. They're empty, of course, but you get all sorts of things in tins. Peaches and baked beans. You have to open them with a can opener like this. He took out of his pocket a tin opener, which he usually carried around with him. It was just the sort of a butterfly handle, which he just had to turn. Just to show, he fitted it onto the bottom of one of the empty tins and twisted the handle. The opener crept round the edge of the tin. The blade ploughed into the metal at the bottom, and soon the shiny round disc of metal came loose. Stig was fascinated. He looked at the flat, round piece of tin which had been at the bottom, and he looked at the rest of the empty tube, which was all that was left of the rest of it. And he took the tin open from Farm Barney and turned the handle. He just couldn't quite make it out. It's quite easy, Stig. Look, said Barney. Took another tin, fitted the opener on the bottom, and showed him how to work it. And there was another round plate and another tin tube. Then Stig had to have a go, and they started on a third. One of the tins had become rather flattened, but it gave Barney an idea of how it could be used. He took it, left Stig with the others, and towed the truck into the den along to the place where Stig had been digging at the chalk. There was quite a lot of loose rubble lying around there, and Barney set to work shoveling it into the truck with the flattened tin. It was certainly better than using his hands, though it wasn't quite the right sort of shovel shape yet. He hammered at it with an unbroken flintstone and made it into quite a handy scoop, like the sort of the village grocer used for shoveling sugar into little paper bags. He toiled away until the truck was heaped full. He held much more chalk than the tin bath, and because of its wheels, he could pull away at it quite easily. Look, Stig, he said as he went past where Stig was sitting. Look at all the chalk I've loaded. But Stig seemed too busy to notice. Barney wheeled the truck along to the place where they were now dumping the chalk and tipped out his load. Then he ran back to the den with the truck bouncing along empty behind him. When he got back, Stig was sitting there, surrounded by round plates of tin and empty tubes, and just in the act of taking the bottom out of the last tin. Stig, what are you doing? Exclaimed Barney. You've spoiled all the tins now. You can't keep things in them with no bottoms. He was really quite annoyed. What was the use of a lot of tin tubes with no ends? Stig sat there playing with them. He seemed to have the idea of fitting one inside the other, but that wouldn't work because they were all exactly the same size. However, one of them had got a bit pinched and didn't fit into another, which seemed to please him a lot. Barney thought it was a bit childish of Stig to sit there playing like a baby with plastic bricks when there was all that work to be done. But Stig went on, seriously worrying over the problem of fitting them together. He found that by pinching together the end of a tin, he could make it fit into the next one, and soon he had 4 or 5 fitted together like the length of a stove pipe. Stove pipe! Barney knew there was something Stig needed badly. "You are clever, Stig," he said. "You've made a chimney." Stig looked blank. He didn't know he needed a chimney. He didn't know what a chimney was. Certainly he'd made one, but if it hadn't been for Barney, he wouldn't have known. Working together, they fitted all the tins one into the other until the pipe that was taller than either of them. With Barney directing, they carried it into the smoky den, where it was too long to stand upright. A nice picture of them making the pipe there. "Now all we've got to do is poke it through the roof," said Barney. Stig looked doubtful at him, but together they managed quite easily to push it through a crack between the piece of linoleum and a sheet of corrugated iron. But now what? They couldn't just leave it hanging there above the fire. "I know," exclaimed Barney, "the bath." He left Stig patiently holding the chimney and went and fetched the tin bath. What luck! It had a rusty hole in the bottom, which only needed a little work with a boot scraper to make it big enough to fit the chimney through. Stig was dimly beginning to see what Barney was trying to do. Together they built up a fireplace of chalk blocks and big flints, rested the bath upside down on top, and there was a mantelpiece and a chimney, with a flue leading from the hole in the upturned bath through the roof and into the open air. Barney lit the fire, which Stig had laid out as they built the fireplace, and threw some additional scraps of paper and twigs onto it. Once the smoke had learnt its way, it went roaring up the pipe. They rushed outside, and there it was coming out what looked like a proper chimney pot sticking through the roof. Stig watched, fascinated. "There you are, Stig," said Barney. "Now you've got a proper fireplace. People can come and visit you without getting their eyes full of smoke." Actually, Stig didn't seem to care very much about having the place full of smoke, but he was as pleased with his fireplace as if it had been a new toy, and kept on putting twigs and leaves on the fire so that he'd go out and see the smoke coming out of the other end. And Barney was so proud of his invention that he looked round for something else to invent. He saw the stack of jam jars. What had he bought those for? It would be too dull to use them to keep the food in. Stig's den wasn't that sort of place. He had to think of a new way of using jam jars. What had he thought Stig's house needed most? A chimney. He got that now. A chimney and, oh yes, a window. A window. Well, windows were made of glass, and so were jam jars. Yes, but the shape. Doors were made of wood, and so were clothes pegs. Ships were made out of steel, and so were tin openers. But you can't make a ship out of tin openers, or a door out of clothes pegs. The shapes were wrong. You couldn't hammer a glass flat, could you? He picked up the boot scraper. No, of course not. Stig had a stack of the jars on top of each other, lying on their sides. They made a sort of wall of glass, like that. But they rolled about, and of course there were gaps between the jars. Barney looked at one side of the den, the darker side, which really needed windows. It was built of wooden boxes from the dump, bottoms outwards, open tops inwards. He took the digging tool and knocked the bottom out of one. There was now an open square where the daylight came in, but so did the wind, and Stig didn't seem at all pleased at sitting in a draught. Stig's like to be snug, thought Barney. He carried the jars in and stacked them in the frame of the box. They fitted quite well. The light came in, but the draught came in too. Stig got up and looked at the gaps between the jars, grunted, and went out of the den. Barney followed him, wondering. Stig led the way along the bottom of the cliff to where there had lately been a landslide, and quite a large chunk of cliff top had come down in one piece. Between the topsoil and the chalk there was a layer of red clay, good damp squidgy stuff you could make model animals with. Stig began to dig out a lump of clay with his fingers. Barney found another good clay mine and did the same. They got as much as they could carrying and took it from the back to the den. From the outside of Stig set to work to fill the gaps between the jam jars. They made 2 more journeys before all the jams were firmly bedded in clay, and then Barney carefully wiped the smears of the bottoms of the jars with a rag. Then they stood and admired their window. They even made faces at one another, one standing inside and one outside, before you could almost see through it. Because it was certainly let the light in, even though it was late in the afternoon, and there was not much light to let in. Well, well, said Barney, that's that. It was a thing he had often heard his grandfather say when he'd finished a dark job. He was tired after all the inventing he had done. He went to sit down, and then he saw all the round plates of tin that Stig had cut out, lying round on the floor. He gathered them up. There must be use for them too. He went back to the window and found that the discs fitted exactly over the ends of the jars if you pressed them into the soft clay. There was just enough to go round. There you are, Stig, he said, like on a ship, to shut out the potholes. And if you don't want people to look in, or to shut the dark out. There was a feeling in the evening air that darkness was coming in, and that it would be snug to sit by the new fireplace and watch the fire going up the chimney. But Barney suddenly remembered something and stood up with his mouth open. Stig, he said, I've got to go home, all the way home, I mean. I probably won't be staying with Granny until Christmas. Stig looked at him. Stig, said Barney, when I come back again, you will be here, won't you? Stig didn't answer, but he went into a little niche in the chalk wall, poked out among some of the things that Barney had brought back, which he gave to Barney. He looked at it. It was a little chipped flint, perfectly shaped like a flat Christmas tree and very sharp. An arrowhead, Barney gasped. For me? Oh, thank you, Stig. I really must go now. See you at Christmas. You will be here at Christmas, won't you, Stig? Goodbye. And he ran off. As he made his way along the bottom of the pit, he felt he knew the way there better than anywhere else in the world. He felt that Stig's house was as much as his home as anywhere else. After all, it was like a drawing picture. Once you put a chimney and a window on a house, you've really made a house. Okay, so that's the end of the second chapter there. My last question to you is, if you wanted to give anything to Stig, to improve his house, what would it be? Can you draw what Stig's house might look like with your invention there? Okay, and that's your final question. Okay, hope you've enjoyed it. See you soon. Bye.